Julia.
Okay, hello.
Try that.
Hello?
Yeah.
All right. Life sketch. The historian that my grandpa was, the life sketch of my grandfather is partly constructed from his own autobiographical writings. And where his own words ended, I relied on the oral histories from my mother and my aunties and uncles. Manuel Fauni was born on September 24, 1931 in the Philippines under United States occupation. The exact location of his birth is a matter of historical debate, but prevailing evidence, aka a poll of my mom, aunties, and uncles, suggests he was most likely born in the town of Alapan, Imus, Cavite, the ancestral town that housed multiple generations of Faunis, stretching back at least 2 centuries. Uwing, as his friends and family called him, was the 6th child of Simeon Ubod Fauni, a foreman who oversaw construction projects during a period of rapid development in the American colonial period, and Paula Nato Fauni, a homemaker who managed both care of her children and their horses and calesas, or horse-drawn carriages. Uwing was a part of a family of politicians and business owners, his siblings from eldest to youngest, Wenceslao or Kuya Islao, David, Asuncion or Ateshon, Urbano, and Concepcion Espiritu or Atempium. Though Uwing was often referred to as the bunso, or the youngest of the family, Simeon and Paula had one other child together named Jose, who died as an infant. And with another woman who he had met during a work trip, Uwing's father Simeon had a separate child named Remigio, or Uncle Remy Pujeda. At a young age, Uwing's parents moved their family north from Imus to the capital, trading their lush barrio of rice fields and rivers for the dense urban center of the Tondo neighborhood of Manila. But due to World War II, such a move was short-lived. Like many Filipinos in my grandpa's generation, the events of World War II interrupted his childhood and in many ways shaped the rest of his life. He later described the period of Japanese occupation in the Philippines as, quote, 3 years of living in fear and near starvation. Later in life, memories of the war were a frequent topic of my grandpa's famous monologues over the dinner table or at holidays. In 1942, at age 10, as bombs from Imperial Japanese warplanes destroyed government buildings, schools, and churches, Uwing and his family fled Manila back to their ancestral town in Imus. This would be the first of several forced relocations during the war. At the time of the first evacuation, his father Simeon was gravely ill with stomach cancer. Uwing remembered joining his father on long walks outside on the dirt roads, which would help relieve his father's swelling feet. When his father became bedridden, his father asked to be brought to Alapan, Imus, his birthplace, where he died on an evening in June 1942, and was buried amid a large funeral procession drawing relatives, friends, and politicians from across the Philippines. Uwing grew anxious of how his family would survive without their patriarch. When the fighting in the city subsided, my grandpa and his family returned to their home in Tondo, Manila. As the occupying Japanese forces squeezed the country of its resources, food became scarce. They subsisted largely off government-controlled rations. The men and children of Manila often smuggled bags of rice from train depots out of desperation to feed their children. To make money for the Fauni family, my grandpa's eldest sister, Ate Shon, converted the first floor of their Manila house into a sari-sari store or a convenience store. His eldest brother, Kuya Islao, operated a billiard hall and bar. My grandpa, even as a child, started his own business, standing in long lines to collect rationed cigarettes and matches to then resell to billiard players and patrons at his brother's bar. It was also during this dark period of communal and personal grief that my grandpa found religion. During the final years of the war in 1944, my grandpa's eldest brother, Kuya Islao, fell ill. on his deathbed, he was surrounded by members of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. He recalled his brother's final moments as he slipped into death while the churchgoers sang hymns. In 1944, death was a daily occurrence in Manila as Filipinos regularly died of starvation collapsing on the streets. Uwing recalled seeing city workers scooping up bodies, pulling them onto carts and hauling them into a nearby hospital morgue. Smoke rising from the morgue's chimneys was a regular sight from my grandpa's home. Some U.S. government reports from that year estimated about 500 people dying of starvation each day in Manila. These memories of mass death were absent from our holiday gatherings. Instead, my grandpa often retold a more triumphant story from the war, telling about how he saved his village from Japanese soldiers. It goes something like this. When Uwing's family evacuated a second time from Manila back to Imus, a unit of Japanese soldiers marched into their barrio in search of Filipino rebel fighters. Residents quickly ran to hide inside their homes. He recalled the memory of some residents concealing a shotgun belonging to one of the rebels under a card table. As everyone hid, Uwing bravely stepped out to meet the soldiers. They asked for the name of the barrio. Because learning Japanese was compulsory in schools during the war, he was able to speak to the soldiers in their language and managed to divert them to another barrio, sparing Imus from violence. After the war ended, Uwing's mother, Paula, also fell ill. Leading up to her death, his mother began taking Bible studies from a Seventh-day Adventist preacher and would eventually be baptized into the church. Uwing's sister-in-law, Luisa Banaag, the widow of Kuya Islao, had introduced the Seventh-day Adventist religion to the family several years earlier. One Saturday morning, when Uwing was 15 years old, his mother stopped him as he ran up the stairs of their home, asking him to come with her to church to get baptized. He rebuffed her request, which he later said he regretted, telling her that he instead preferred his hobby of watching films at the local movie theaters. Days later, his mother returned to Imus, where she died in February 1946. Shortly after, my grandpa began attending church services with his ate Luisa. He grew a liking to the music and sermons and began jotting down notes and Bible verses, beginning his lifelong devotion of deep study of biblical text. 2 months later, he became a devout follower of Jesus and was baptized as a part of Manila Central SDA Church. Still grieving his mother's death, his mother's Sabbath morning invitation to church still rang in his ears. Jesus wasn't the only thing that Uwing found in the church. He also found the love of his life, Encarnacion de Eucario. They first met in the Manila Central SDA Church. Both were active members, and Encarnacion, or Shoni, liked Uwing's leadership qualities, leading youth groups and church programs. From this point on, this story no longer belongs only to Uwing, but to Uwing and Shoni. One day, my grandpa made his first move in courting Shoni. At Shoni's family home, Uwing sat with her and asked her, "How do you feel about me?" Shoni responded, "Can't you see it in my eyes?" Uwing felt like he was walking on clouds the entire way home. On December 27, 1953, Uwing and Shoni married in a morning ceremony in front of family and friends. Instead of a honeymoon, they moved to southern Philippines to Mindanao and immediately started work. Uwing as a high school and college teacher, Shoni as a grade school teacher and principal. When they moved back to Manila in 1955, they then began their family with the birth of Eva, followed by Elaine in 1958, and Elita Ann in 1961, and then in 1963, the bunso, my mom, Elmarissa. When he was a student, my grandpa was studious, independent, humble, yet ambitious. During his senior year at Pacific Union College Academy in 1949, he was elected senior class president after a savvy campaign supported by the popularity of Luz Santo Domingo, who along with their eventual husband, Nguyen's relative, Benny Benag, would become lifelong friends. For college, my grandpa enrolled at Manuel Luis Quezon University in Manila, majoring in history with a minor in English, then going on to earn his master's degree in history and education. His thesis, finished in 1953, focused on the final push by Filipino leaders to gain independence from the United States in 1946. As passionate as Nguyen was about his faith in God, he also was equally passionate about his nationalism and love for the Philippines and history. He and I bonded over our love for history and politics and would often pick a corner during holidays to talk shop. I was always eager to absorb his well of knowledge. It was through his studies in college where his pride in the Philippines deepened, and conversely, where he began to see the United States for what it was, an imperialistic colonial force that for 4 decades stripped Filipinos of their rights, favoring the interests of American corporations that were eager to exploit the Philippines of its resources and labor. Nguyen would find out that the library he relied on in Manila had secretly been operated by the CIA. No wonder there weren't any books critical of the US on its shelves. For decades, Nguyen supported the withdrawal of the US military from Filipino soil and an end to the American military bases across the country. The US ignored the demands of Filipinos. But in 1991, when Mount Pinatubo erupted, the volcanic ash and mud flows heavily damaged Clark Air Base, forcing the US military to leave. Grandpa would call the volcanic eruption later in life, quote, God's will. It's also Nguyen's nationalism that led him to oppose then President Ferdinand Marcos when in the 1960s began his authoritarian grip on the Philippines. His lectures as a history professor were at times filled with criticisms of the Marcos regime's corruption. While pursuing his doctorate in history, Nguyen held various jobs. He was a data and polling supervisor with Robot Gallup, a marketing manager for a pharmaceutical company, and the co-owner of an appliances business selling refrigerators and stoves, driving long distances from Manila as far as Baguio City to deliver their products. When his business dissolved in 1969, he began to teach history at Philippine Union College, where he also served as the dean of the School of Liberal Arts. His students knew him to be a strict professor who graded papers with a stern eye and a loose pen. While the work was rewarding, the pay was meager, and the Adventist Church at times failed to pay him his wages on time, leaving little money for the basic necessities for his young family. The family's worsening economic situation played a key factor in deciding to immigrate to the US. In 1972, during one trip to the US to further his doctoral studies doing research at the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA, President Marcos declared martial law in the Philippines, depriving Filipino citizens of their civil rights. Although my grandpa was supposed to return to the Philippines that year, he remained in the US, fearing his anti-Marcos sentiments would land him in prison, the fate of thousands of political opponents of the Marcos regime. Meanwhile, his wife, Shoni, stayed behind, splitting time working as a college librarian and preparing their 4 children for immigration to the US, navigating the maze-like visa process, a nearly impossible task amid a dictatorship. But through a friend who worked in the visa office in Manila in 1972, Shoni, Eva, Elaine, Anne, and Marissa were able to join their father in the US. The family's first landing spot in the US was Wilmington, California, in Los Angeles County's South Bay, living in Section 8 housing projects across the street from an industrial lot and several blocks from the city's towering oil refineries. That year, Nguyen had to adapt once again to a new reality, setting aside his doctoral studies of history and his political opposition to the US government, working in a new country toward a better future for him and his family. He began his career as an insurance salesman for New York Life, a position he held until retirement in the early 1990s, winning various sales awards along the way. His client base was mostly fellow Filipinos, whether relatives or members of the church he would attend. He would travel where the clients were, driving across the US, At times, he'd make the cross-country trips into family vacations, packing up Shoni and the kids into their camper, making trips to Vancouver, the Midwest, and New York. To motivate himself, Ewing took a piece of paper and drew a picture of a house made of bricks set with trees in the yard, writing on the paper, "Dream house, $40,000 house," and taped the picture onto his bathroom mirror. Ewing regularly met his self-imposed quotas of 10 insurance applications per month. Shoni also played her own part in Ewing's sales work, pushing him to keep going, hosting dinner parties for clients, keeping him awake on late-night drives after meeting clients. Shoni also kept a Rolodex of their clients, writing cards to them on birthdays and holidays. After several years of stubbornly dedicating themselves to work, Ewing and Shoni achieved their goal of their dream home, buying a house in Peacock Lane in the La Sierra neighborhood of Riverside, which had an uncanny resemblance to Ewing's earlier drawing. Their success also allowed them to support their 4 children through college. Ewing counted this as among his greatest accomplishments, seeing his 4 children become professionals in their fields. When my grandpa wasn't working, he dedicated much of his time to his faith, attending many churches across Southern California. In their earlier days, a lot of their time was spent in Filipino church congregations, enjoying entire Saturdays from morning until evening, worshiping, socializing, and eating together at the church or at each other's homes. My grandma and grandpa were also proud members of Valley Seventh-day Adventist Church, where Ewing served as a head elder and Shoni served as a head deaconess. His religious life was also spent in deep study of the Bible and the writings of Ellen G. White, developing a focus on God's plan of salvation. His answer to the darkness of this world was a focused path toward what the Bible calls a new earth and a new heaven. His convictions led him to travel back to the Philippines several times to hold evangelism series where he would pass out bags of rice in the door before preaching. He went on to self-publish books in English and Tagalog based on his studies. Those evangelistic series in the 2000s would be his final trips to the Philippines. My grandpa also stayed in touch with his original barkada from the Philippines, helping organize high school reunion trips calling themselves the 49ers for the year they graduated together. His siblings, Kuya David and Ate Empion, and their children would also join Ewing in the United States in later years. He, however, deeply missed his Ate Shon, who became a mother figure to my grandpa after the death of his parents. Ate Shon lived in the Philippines until her death in 2000, which brought my grandpa back to his hometown of Imus, where she was buried in the same cemetery as their parents. Starting in the 1980s, Ewing and Shoni also welcomed life as grandparents. They often babysat us grandkids. Our days were spent watching my grandma tend to her vegetable and flower gardens, helping grandma and grandpa in the kitchen, cooking vegetarian Filipino food and Filipino desserts such as halo-halo and palitaw. Nap time was mandatory. On the TV, my grandpa often had on the Lakers, Dodgers, tennis, or a videotape recorded copy of a Charlie Brown Christmas. Uncle Dan and Aunt Sue's story hour of Christian radio hour dramas and Christian contemporary music boomed through my grandpa's sound system. My grandpa took a particular joy in cranking up his subwoofer. As an adult, I've come to realize the groove of heritage singer bass lines are quite underrated. My grandpa had to feel his music. He also loved to play tennis, a sport he picked up while teaching at PUC, playing until his late 80s. My grandma and grandpa were also restless homeowners, moving more than 12 times throughout their more than 50 years in the US, moving once more in La Sierra, in Grand Terrace, Canyon Lake, Menifee, Murrieta, Beaumont, Hemet, back to Menifee, Carlsbad, then back to Beaumont, and then eventually back to Menifee again. In each location, it was astonishing how each home had the familiar furniture, lamps, ceramic figurines, and the framed family photos, giving the sensation of walking into a time capsule transporting you to countless memories spent visiting Grandma and Grandpa. During his final years, Grandpa would speak of death more frankly, aiming for his goal to turn 100, but also accepting that his time was coming. He lived long enough to enjoy 9 grandchildren and 6 great-grandchildren. In October 2024, Ewing said farewell to his partner of more than 70 years. Shoni died at the age of 93. My grandpa spent the last year of his life living in Loma Linda and then Menifee with frequent visits from his daughters who showered him with love until he himself passed away suddenly following a stroke on August 29, also at the age of 93. On September 25, he was buried alongside my grandma in Colton, California, where his daughters and grandchildren and great-grandchildren shared eulogies, prayed, and sang hymns together. Later in his life, when reflecting on his mother's death and faith, my grandpa wrote, as if a promise to himself, to God, and to his own mother, quote, "Oh, how I long for that day when I would see Jesus, our Savior, and my mother there in the earth made new, where there would never be any death and sad parting anymore. She has to be there, for I am one of the stars in her crown." Thank you.